Chess has traveled more than 1,000 years through history to reach you at this exact moment. This game is absolutely fascinating, and I'm very happy to have the privilege of teaching you the rules right now. So chess is a war game played between two people, one with the light pieces and one with the dark pieces, or white and black. It is played on this 8 by 8 checker board with 64 squares in total, alternating between light squares and dark squares. This is the guy it's all about. This right here is the king. And you can notice that both players have one such. In fact, the only difference between the black player and the white player is that white always goes first. And I'm going to teach you all the rules, and if you want some good tips and tricks on how to beat your dad or your friend or your spouse, just check out my other videos. I have more than 100 ASMR videos on chess. Okay, so you want to capture the king, checkmate him out of the board. How do you do that? Well, you use your pieces. I'm going to teach you how each and every one of them moves. So we start with this guy. Look at that. It's not a castle, it is a rook. And the reason you don't call it a castle is because there is a special move involving the rook that you will learn later on that's called a castle. Now we call it a rook, and that is from Persian, Old Persian, and it means war chariot, because even though chess has been played for many years, this particular design of the pieces is of newer origin, particularly in the Middle Ages in Europe. But the game originated in India and traveled with the Muslim Empire from Persia and into Europe. So this used to be a war chariot. And how does it move? Well, the war chariot, or the rook, moves in straight lines as far as it wants to. Go as far as it wants to. Cannot move to a square that's occupied by a piece of the same color, but it can go to a square occupied by an opposing piece, like this. And if you do, you capture the piece, take it out of the board, you have now won that piece. So that is the rook. It can move as far or as short as it wants to in straight lines. Now we have the knight, but we are going to jump over the knight for a little bit and take the bishop first. There is a reason for that, didactic reason that you will understand in just a moment. The bishop here is kind of similar to the rook, can move as long as it wants to or as short as it wants to, but it can only move diagonally. Okay, so it moves on these diagonal lines. Because of that, the bishop can never move from the square, the color of the square that it starts on, to a different color. And that is why we in chess talk about the dark squared bishop trapped in the dark squares and the light squared bishop on the the light squares. And now we have the most powerful piece, the most awesome piece, the queen. And the reason I taught you about the bishop and the rook first is because if you want to know how the queen moves, you just combine the power of these two pieces and voila, a awesome super piece, the queen. That's why you also have only one of these guys, because it's very powerful. It can go in straight lines like the rook and diagonally like the bishop. So, before we get to the knight, let's just talk about the king. The king is sort of an underpowered version of his spouse, the queen, in that he can move in any direction, but only one square, except of course for that little rule called castling that I will tell you about later. So, the king, he has freedom of movement, but it is limited, and as such he's quite weak, and if you lose him, you lose the game, so take care of this guy. Now we come to the knight. My favorite piece, the most iconic piece in chess, and just a very, very cool piece because it's different from all the other pieces in that it can jump over pieces. So, the knight moves in an L shape, like this, or you could say 1, 2, and to the side. So from here, it could go 1, 2 to the side, 1, 2 to the other side, or 1, 2 here, 1, 2 there, there. Could go here if this square wasn't occupied, and same for here. And in addition, the knight is able to jump over pieces, so it is the only one from the back rank that can move without the pawns being moved. So you can start the game like this. It's called the Reti Opening. Or like this, which is not a particularly good move, and I don't think it actually has a name. So, that is most of the rules for all the pieces on the back rank. Now let's talk a little bit about these guys. The pawns. The best player in the world in the 1700s was a bishop. He was an actual bishop, not a chess bishop. He was called Philidor. He was from France. And he said that pawns are the soul of chess. They are the weakest piece, but you have a lot of them, 8 to be exact. How do they move? On their first move, or when they are on their starting square, they can choose to move either 1 square ahead or 2. They cannot go backwards, sideways. They can only move forwards. Once they have moved once, no matter if they chose 1 or 2 squares, they can only ever go 1 square at a time. The pawn is different from all the other pieces in many ways. For instance, it is the only piece that captures differently from how it normally moves. You would think in this position that this pawn could capture this pawn, but no. In fact, neither of these pawns can move because it's not allowed to capture forwards. Instead, the pawn can capture diagonally, like so, or to the other side as well, like so. Here's a small little rule called en passant that many people get very surprised by the first time they see it. it is a real move. It's part of real chess, and I'll show it to you. If, let's say you are playing with the black pieces, and you have a pawn that is threatening, because remember it can capture diagonally forwards like this, a square that an opposing pawn can make this double jump over, you are actually allowed on your next move to capture it as though you captured it while it was going. Sort of an attack of opportunity. So it goes, hey, I'm coming, yeah, I will totally get there. No, I'll get you. And since it's an attack of opportunity, you cannot just sit idly by, let them do this move, do some other move, and then when it's your go, say, now I want to capture en passant. No, that does not fly in chess. Okay, if you're confused by this rule, don't worry, it doesn't come up that often if you are a beginner or learning player. One more thing about the pawns. If the pawns advance in life, they are like you, seemingly small and insignificant. But if they are ambitious, if they work towards their goal, let's say these pieces are not here, and with a little luck, together with ambition, because everybody needs a little luck, and they reach the back rank of their opponent, they can become anything they want to, except the king. So, for instance, this pawn could become a queen. Wouldn't you like to become a queen? Notice I already have a queen. That is not a problem. You can also make a knight if the position really demands it, a rook or a bishop, but that is extremely rare. Maybe you will never ever play a game of chess where you want to promote, as it's called, a pawn to anything else than a queen. But you can if you want to. So. Now, let me talk a little bit about the king. So, how do we capture the king? Could we just go and capture him? Well, not exactly. We want to do something that's called checkmating the king. And don't worry at all. It's very simple in a way. Just think about it this way. Every time the king is in some position, let's say this was moved, so it went up here, because white is being played by somebody very new to chess maybe, so they made this very strange opening. And you go 1, 2 to the side, you proclaim check to the king. And that means that you are now able to capture the king. The word check is like chess, and it comes from India, where the game was invented. It is a sort of bastardization, or sort of the word has transformed into Czech. It used to be Shah, meaning the emperor or the king in the old Indian language. And checkmate comes from Checkmate, meaning the king is dead or the king is helpless. And I will explain this helpless part. So you proclaim check. And that's sort of a gentlemanly thing to do, so the king knows, okay, I have to get out of the way, otherwise I will lose my king. Or maybe if I have a pawn here or whatever, I can capture the checking piece. Or if it was not a knight, but maybe it was a bishop giving check to the king. Let's say actually this position here. The bishop is giving check to the king. The king can move, There's no way to capture this, but you can also interpose another piece. As long as you stop the check, as long as your king can no longer be captured, then you are good and can play on. So what is checkmate and how is it different from check? Okay, let me make sort of an artificial position again here. I hope this is okay for the camera angle. So you have the king in this position. And your opponent, me in this case, plays this move, check. So what's different from this check and the other checks we've seen? Well. The king cannot move, it's not allowed to exit the board, cannot go to a square occupied by one of its own pieces. Here it would still be able to be captured, so it's not moving out of check. Same goes for here. And there is no piece able to capture the rook. So no matter what white does in this situation, on the next move, she, he, or they will lose the king. And that is what we call checkmate. So you can think of it as you stop the game one move before the king would be lost. So we changed the angle just a little bit here, because now it's time to learn about castling, which is maybe the toughest rule in chess. Don't worry, I got your back. I will explain everything. Just lean back, relax, and learn. So, you know how to checkmate the king. Wouldn't you really like it if there was a way for you to make it very hard for your opponent to checkmate you? There is such a way, and it's called castling. So, let's say that all the pieces between the king and one rook, they have all moved out of the way. And let's also say that the king has never moved in this game and the rook has never moved in this game. Then you can do this cool thing. King goes two squares, not one. And on the same move, the rook goes to the other side of the king. And that is called castling. And you can see why. You have the pawns forming sort of the wall of the castle, and the rook being the tower on the side of the castle. So you can do this to both sides. Let's say that this is the position. Here you can also castle 1, 2, rook goes to the other side, and the king is snug as a bug in a rug in his castle, while his forces, led by the mighty queen, goes after his esteemed opponent. So there are some conditions that have to be met for castling to be legal. As I mentioned, the king cannot have moved, and the castling rook cannot have moved. You can move this rook and still castle, no problem. Also, doesn't count if you move and go back. You lose the right to castle. What else? Okay, let's say this knight is here, and this bishop is here. Now the bishop is checking the king. Wouldn't it be cool if you could just castle out of check? No. You are not allowed to castle out of check. Let's say this bishop is gone. The bishop is here. Of course, you cannot castle into check as well, because the bishop would check the king and you would lose the king. That's no good. How about with the bishop here? Could you castle now? No, and why not? Because the king would be moving over a square attacked by an enemy piece, and therefore castling is not allowed. The rook is allowed to pass over a square attacked by the enemy, but not the king. Okay. You cannot castle out of check. You cannot castle through check. You cannot castle into check. And the castling rook cannot have moved. And the castling king cannot have moved. And those are the rules of chess. I will show you a small example game after saying just a few words about how to set up the pieces and the board. Okay, so let's do a different angle here so we can see everything. So number one is, how do we orient the board? And the rule is that there should be a light square in the bottom right corner, and that would go, of course, for both players. This doesn't technically change the game, so you can orient the board the wrong way and still play a game. But since there are some rules about where the king and the queen start, it can be quite confusing if you do it the wrong way. And also, many chessboards come with numbers on this side that go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, starting from white's side, and letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And that means that you can easily write down the game, either with just saying a piece moved from B1 to C3, or you can learn something called Algebraic Notation that is a sort of shorthand that makes it even easier and faster to write down the game. And if you want to do those kinds of things, please remember to orient the board correctly. How do we place the pieces? Let's start with the king. The king is on the opposite color of himself. White king on dark square, black king on light square. The queen has a bit more fashion sense, and she goes on the square that matches, so that everything looks nice and neat and, of course, powerful. Next to the king and the queen, we have the bishops. This is a reflection of how power was divided in the Middle Ages in Europe, that we had royalty as the most powerful, and just after them we had the church, the bishops. The knights are second to the rooks here. They represent the army, and the rooks are easy to remember because you would have, imagine the whole thing is a castle and there is a tower in each side of the castle. Then we have all the pawns in front of the pieces. If the chessboard is well designed, the king should be the tallest piece, then the queen, then the bishops, knights, rooks, and pawns. And this makes it much easier to read the chessboard. I will give you an example game, just the first maybe 6, 7, 8 moves, just to give you a sense of how it's a good idea to open up the game. So I recommend that you choose either the king's pawn or the queen's pawn. Whatever one you choose, the next at least 10 games you play, you start by, let's say you choose the king, you take the king's pawn and go 2 spaces ahead, like so. If you choose the queen, you will go like so. And then what you do is you try to develop all your pieces. Let's say your opponent will do something like this, and you can do something like this. And if you look at what I'm doing here, let's say we go here, or maybe just here, just to make it easier. Here, 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 and castles. So this is a very artificial way of starting the game that I sort of improvised, and I just wanted to show you because many new players have no idea how to open up the game. So what did White do here in the start of this game? Well, they occupied the center with the pawns. They moved all of their pieces, all the heavy pieces, off the back rank. They didn't move any piece twice. They spent every move getting a piece into play, and they castled early. What does all this accomplish? Well, if you occupy and control the center of the chessboard, it's hard for your opponent to maneuver around. If you bring all your friends to the party, it would be a great party. And remember that you are attacking these guys. So do you want to attack with just 2 people attacking 16? That's not a good idea. Better idea is to attack with all your friends. And lastly, you got the king to safety before your opponent was able to launch an attack. And then when you have done all this, you figure out where you want the queen and the rooks. And there are loads and loads and loads more advanced chess strategies that you can find on my channel. I'll just let this play a little bit so you can enjoy the beautiful water and the beautiful sounds and the chessboard. Thank you so much for watching. I hope I will see you in the next video.